Hi and welcome to the presentation on design briefs. My name's Daniel Reid. I'm a PhD student from Northumbria University, and the following presentation has been presented to the Northumbria students on the 18th of January, and the aim of it is just to give the students a good idea into how to consider or what to consider when writing design briefs, and some kind of issues to bear in mind when the briefs are being constructed, and just to outline the relationship that the design brief plays within this project. The example here, it's deliberately meant to be quite crude and misleading, but the point this is trying to make is that on face value, information and kind of language used within a brief can potentially be very misleading and interpreted very differently depending on your background and your kind of the point this was trying to make is that the same item in the US and the UK is called something very differently. For example, what the Americans or the people from the US may call a fanny pack, the British people call it a bum bag. So again, our own subjective viewpoint means we interpret things very differently, and clarity and awareness is a real key aspect when considering writing a brief. I think the following quote illustrates quite well about how, well, the quote says your design can only be as good as the brief you worked from. And not necessarily in terms of how good the brief looks or how kind of, the actual graphic design or the layout or I think it's on a deeper level. It's does the communication kind of hit all of the right points? Is it conveying the message, and is that kind of initial intention passed on to the people who are receiving the brief? Again, this analogy here of describing the brief as, like a compass. So the brief should tell everybody where north is, and then everybody can head in the same direction. And I think this is particularly relevant when briefs are written by a number of people. In this case, the students will be writing briefs in a group, and to take all of them ideas and kind of compile them and have a kind of a mutual understanding and clarity within that group is quite a challenging thing. So on a basic level, a brief is a way of turning ideas and thoughts that may be, represented in mood images or kind of videos and various things captured online or from books, and that's turned into language. And the idea is it needs to be kind of well articulated and kind of well described so that, a wide audience can read that and interpret that and make sense of all of that kind of work that's gone in from the people writing the brief. Just to kind of put the brief in the context of a project timeline, you can see here that the brief is just one of those milestones where a lot of information has to be kind of clarified, tied down, and kind of made a bit more specific. And the same kind of process will happen at the specification stage and also an evaluation stage. But these kind of in-between stages, and the stage the students are at the minute, is this background research, like gathering and collecting and scoping. And eventually that has to kind of form some kind of, succinct sort of document and a piece of kind of refined literature that can convey exactly what the task in hand's intended to be. The student groups in this project will actually play two roles. The first role is the role of the client, and whereby they create a brief which is inspired by a local myth, festival or a tale, and that brief is delivered to the collaborators, which the overseas counterparts in most cases, and the collaborators will generate concepts to which will then form the basis of a designed artifact that the students who constructed the brief will actually manufacture for themselves. So essentially they're writing a brief, they're outlining a project that will be executed by themselves. So kind of the importance of the brief here is communicating that kind of key information to the collaborators, but also leaving a bit of room for them to kind of put their own spin and work with that and make that kind of an interesting and fun process for them before ultimately they have to complete and manufacture the project. The second role the role of the designers. So as we discussed before, in the role of the designers, they'll receive a brief which has been inspired by their client's myth or festival, just the complete opposite of role one. So when they receive this brief, it's kind of that whole process of interpreting the information, kind of pulling out and starting to think about design concepts, and then taking these concepts and passing them back over to their client, in this case, which is their collaborators, and kind of the idea is it kind of doing that brief justice of taking that and kind of, again, having the interesting kind of part of this is putting their own spin, their own interpretation, but also kind of building upon, them themes outlined in the brief, and being able to put that into their own concepts and pass that back over. So the question of why do we even have briefs? Well, I think just on a very simple level, it gets everybody started with a common understanding of what needs to be accomplished and when. So a time scale, exactly what we're planning to deliver and when, which is a pretty key factor when kind of, starting any project. And again, it's a good opportunity to define sort of expectations and objectives for the project. So the brief is a really good starting point for them initial discussions. And again, I think projects can be quite challenging, and a brief is a great opportunity to outline that direction and use it as a benchmark later on to either test and evaluate concepts. But also as projects progress, it's always good to have that brief there in the background so everybody knows where they've started from, and they can obviously see where the kind of the direction's going and if things are going off track. So why is it important at this moment, which is the stage of beginning to write briefs, meeting your collaborators, your overseas collaborators? Well, right now you're kind of laying down the statement of what you will do, exactly what you intend to do, and you're starting to lay down boundaries that you need to agree on as a team before you move forward. So it's that real kind of valuable scoping and kind of initial discussions that go on that kind of hinge around the brief quite often. And yeah, it gives you a chance to clearly sort of state your intentions, and kind of being very clear very early gives you the best chance possible of receiving really good concepts from your counterparts. So there'll be lots of scoping activity going on, collection of mood images and research. And I think having to consider how to formulate the brief, this gives that some kind of structure. And even if that's, on a very basic level, bullet pointing or sectioning off areas, it really helps kind of just put the things down, and kind of, it's almost like a bit of a mind dump. Quite often it can be quite a useful exercise just to have that all down in one place on the paper, or saved in whichever format, just to kind of ease that pressure on the memory of trying to remember all of the things that you've covered. And I think I often think about the brief as the equivalent of a contract, because if this was, a project within industry, essentially you'd kind of draw up a contract or an agreement with a client and outline exactly what the project is. And I mean, this project's no different. By kind of, agreeing and working with your collaborators, you start to begin to draw up a brief, and you're kind of entering into agreement about this is what we're doing, and this is what we want you to do for us. In terms of format, I think there's no definitely wrong or right answer. I think the first impression's really important of a brief, and people's expectation will quite commonly be, something like seen on the left here, the kind of the standard A4 kind of word process document. But there's nothing to kind of stop groups just experimenting and kind of using, relying on images, videos, and a whole variety of media. I think the format that you choose needs to kind of reflect the kind of basis of your ideas. So if you're trying to explain something like a festival or a myth or a tale, things like storyboards and videos and imagery is going to be a lot more effective than just a document. But equally, if you're describing a specific product with lots of details and kind of technical information, then obviously that word process document is going to work a lot better. But I think the most important thing to consider is just that does that format kind of match the context of the project. So again, the level of detail and how kind of balanced in terms of how open and how specific what you describe is a key thing. That the brief needs to feel workable. It needs to feel like the people you're passing it to have some room for manoeuvre. They need to feel like they can put their own spin on it and actually enjoy doing it, because being too specific too early on, it's not going to allow for much scope, and it's not really going to be enjoyable. It becomes more of a chore, just kind of, and essentially the concepts that may come back from your collaborators will be quite predictable and boring, and really it doesn't move on. There's not that input from your designers, who as a client technically you're employing to turn your brief into something exciting and kind of interesting for you then to manufacture. There are various kind of headings and aspects to consider in a brief, and I've outlined just a few here, such as the target audience, the context. So in this kind of project where you're talking about festivals and things like that, I think the context of use or how it's executed is really quite different from just a bog standard product that is used in a very specific circumstance. I think that wider context and there's a lot more issues to consider with something that's not as straightforward as just a kind of a usable product. I think one thing to always remember is that the criteria that you're going to set out in your brief can be used to evaluate the success of your final ideas. So ultimately, in industry, the client writes the brief, passes that over, and then at the end they kind of want to know that the brief's been fulfilled, issues that have been outlined have been solved, for example. So I think the brief can be a really useful way of kind of reflecting at the end and trying to consider, did we fulfill this brief? Have we kind of achieved what we set out to do? So before you send a brief, I would advise that just kind of taking a step back and considering that kind of values and themes that have been chosen to be conveyed in the brief. Are these coming through? Is it obvious? Does this, is the brief very clear? Is it kind of obvious for all the work and kind of the direction that's it's gone into that? Does that come through? So I think it's really important to just have that extra bit of consideration before this is passed over, because once it's passed over and those receiving it have kind of read that brief, first impressions are really important, and I think it's just very important to kind of to get that right early on. Obviously things aren't always really straightforward, and change will happen, and that's common with a lot of projects, but I think once the brief's been clarified, you need to be careful how you negotiate with your collaborators. So if kind of great ideas come to your head, or ideas that you think may not be kind of strictly following the brief, I think any of those kind of decisions need to be discussed quite carefully and kind of negotiate those changes, rather than just kind of blindly going off on a tangent without kind of keeping that contact between the kind of client and designer relationship. So there is some further reading that I would recommend about design briefs. And there's a title here, Creating the Perfect Design Brief, which is widely available by Peter Phillips. It has a lot of detail about kind of the context of a brief and what it can enable, really, and the value of a good brief. And the Design Council has produced leaflets and kind of a lot of information for people who are writing briefs for the first time from small organisations, and it's a real kind of good introduction about what you would consider when writing a brief, and I think these could be very useful if you have interest to kind of look into this further. Thanks a lot for listening. That's the end of the presentation. I hope that's kind of helped and given you some thoughts about how you would go about writing your own briefs and things to consider. So yeah, thanks again.